As the Kustos appointed by the Faculty of Social Sciences, I open the public examination of Master of Social Sciences Bradley Reynolds' doctoral dissertation, Alternating Visions of Europe's Post-Cold War Security Architecture, Finnish, American, and Russian Peace Mediation in Nagorno-Karabakh from 1995 to 1997. As the official opponent is Professor Jussi Hanhimäki from the Geneva Graduate Institute.
I think I'll take this one. How are our speakers on? Yes. Okay. Okay. Honored Kustos, honored opponent, members of the audience. Today, I will present my doctoral dissertation for public examination titled Alternating Visions of Europe's Post-Cold War Security Architecture, Finnish, American, and Russian Peace Mediation in Nagorno-Karabakh, 1995 to 1997. This work is the result of multinational archival research from Finnish, American, European Union, United Nations, United Kingdom, and Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, or OSCE, archives. This is paired with oral history interviews with Finnish and American decision makers, utilizing a method I term foreign policy oral history. In this doctoral dissertation, I argued for continued research on smaller states and international history. Great power politics has been in vogue for some years now. We should not forget, however, the numerous policy projects smaller states undertook in the Cold War as well as post-Cold War period. These actions also shaped the European security architecture. I utilized the case study of Finnish peace mediation in Nagorno-Karabakh through the OSCE Minsk Group from 1995 to 1997 as one example to prove this point. Finland, together with Russia, was responsible for leading and co-chairing the OSCE Minsk Group. This was the diplomatic body responsible for peace mediation in Nagorno-Karabakh. Other former Warsaw Pact states, newly independent states that formed out of the Soviet collapse, as well as France, Germany, and the US, were all Minsk Group members. Nagorno-Karabakh was a formerly autonomous region in the Soviet Union that devolved into partisan conflict in 1988, contributing to Soviet collapse. Full-scale war between Armenia and Azerbaijan ensued until a ceasefire was brokered by Russia in 1994. A final peace agreement, however, remained elusive and incentivized international attention. Finland as a mediator of this conflict was significant. It was the first time Finland attempted to mediate an armed conflict in what Russia considered its near abroad. In presenting the case of Nagorno-Karabakh peace mediation, I will outline two main contributions my research makes, as well as one contribution to contemporary debates on Finnish foreign policy. The main contribution of my work is to academic research on Finnish foreign and security policy in the post-Cold War period. The second is to larger debates on historiography of European security in the 1990s. Here, I contemplate the politicized nature of research on this period. This then leads to the third, societal reflection of my work. Scholarship in the 1990s continues to grow. I believe we should further consider how historical research, as well as contemporary political debate, are increasingly intertwined. This is not necessarily a negative phenomenon, but one that needs to be consciously reflected on to maintain a democratic history culture, as well as democratic debate on foreign policy. I will thus argue in this lectio that our understanding of the 1990s remains in a shade of gray. This inhibits both the creativity as well as the political possibilities we willingly consider in contemporary foreign policy debates. Much of the academic literature to date on European security politics focuses on US-Russian relations, as well as NATO and EU enlargement. This is a valuable body of research and pertinent to contemporary policy problems. At the same time, I encourage historians to ask, does this focus accurately represent the complexity of the era? In returning multiple shades of color to the 1990s, historians must reach beyond the question of if NATO should have enlarged or not. Historians should consider what parallel, less successful policy initiatives tell us about the collective hopes and disappointments of the era. Peace mediation in Nagorno-Karabakh is one such initiative. This storyline shifts the geographical focus on European security debates from continental Europe to the post-Soviet space proper. This is significant as the OSCE functioned in the post-Soviet space in ways the EU and NATO could not. This is an aspect of European security debates that has only begun to be comprehensively researched. This is also a research focus that, by and large, requires a perspective other than a focus on US foreign policy. This is because Washington was, quote, woefully ignorant, end quote, of the region until 1997, as described by Frederick Starr, founder of the Kennan Institute. The South Caucasus in the mid-1990s represented a critical moment and context for debates on if and how European security in continental Europe should be tied to security in the post-Soviet space. Would all former Warsaw Pact states and newly independent states truly be allowed to return to Europe, or was there a hierarchy of belonging? A prominent mantra of the period was that post-Cold War European security would no longer be defined by dividing lines. However, politicians argued if Western European and North American were excluded from the Caucasus, this would lead to a divisibility in European security. In other words, a new dividing line. Nagorno-Karabakh, as I argue, fostered a debate over what the new parameters of Europe would be, as well as where a new Europe would end. A key question in this debate was addressing what Max Jakobsen termed the unknown factor in European security politics, Russia. What would Russia's position be inside of or in cooperation with a new Europe? This was an interesting problematic, as the question of what to do regarding Russia differed depending on where one looked. Policy debates for answering this question coalesced around which institutions should work in which regions of a new Europe. Finland was one of the few countries in Europe that continued to significantly focus on the challenges of the post-Soviet space in the 1990s. Finns, along with numerous newly independent states and former Warsaw Pact states, understood that Russia could easily become revanchist. Many Western European and North American decision-makers, on the other hand, neglected that it would be important to provide stability in the post-Soviet space. This was due to either ignorance or a perception that it was best to leave these regions to the Russians. While Helsinki found allies where they could to maintain focus on the newly independent states, this was by and large an uphill battle. The inability to collectively solve these challenges in the 1990s is woefully apparent today. Peace mediation in Nagorno-Karabakh was thus seen as an opportunity. It was a top 3 issue on the Clinton-Yeltsin agenda from 1994 to 1996. As such, it gave Finnish decision-makers seats at many tables. It allowed Finland to build new networks based on existing Finnish foreign policy expertise, also building a new reputation through the process. Taking responsibility for the OSCE offered important political capital when advocating for Helsinki's preferences on how different European security institutions should develop in the 1990s. When Finland joined the EU in 1995, Hiski Haukala and Hanna Ohjanen argued that Finland carried a burden of proof to demonstrate that Finland's Russia expertise was an asset rather than a restriction. U.S. Ambassador to the Minsk Group, Joseph Pretzel, noted that various members of the international community were suspicious that Finland would not be able to balance Russia and peace mediation, as ghosts of Finlandization might remain. The Russians themselves were reportedly suspiciously enthusiastic of a Russian-Finnish co-chairmanship of the Minsk Group. Juho Ovaska, in his path-breaking work on Finnish foreign policy in the 1980s and early 1990s, argued that no effort was made by Helsinki to balance between East and West once the Cold War was over. A study of Finland's reformulation of Russia policy in the post-Cold War period, which Nagorno-Karabakh mediation was an important piece of, shows that the definitions of East and West were fluid in this period. Secondly, Finnish diplomats did continue to balance between the US and Moscow. Old diplomatic tools and Russia expertise were utilized to convince Moscow that cooperation and integration into a new Europe was their best course of action. While this appears idealistic in hindsight, Finnish diplomats nonetheless achieved measurable results. Finns proved their Russia expertise to Brussels as well as Washington. This meant occasionally contesting EU and US policy. Finns also began to build a Russia expertise for a new era. This meant an expertise on the South Caucasus, Central Asia, and the post-Soviet space more generally. Significantly, This was a competency the EU lacked at the time. We can see at least 3 lasting traces of how the OSCE Minsk Group co-chairmanship supported a reformulation of Finland's expertise on Russia. Firstly, the Finnish Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee continues to argue for maintaining Finland's Russia expertise post-2022. The Finnish history of the OSCE Minsk Group is an example of how Finnish diplomats not only maintained, but expanded their knowledge of Russia and adjacent regions in a period of profound international flux. Nowhere is this more apparent than with Ambassador Terhi Hakala, a former member of the Finnish Minsk Group team and now EU Special Representative to Central Asia. I expect that Finland's 2025 chairpersonship of the OSCE will be a similar opportunity to maintain and expand competencies on Ukraine, the South Caucasus, Central Asia, and Russia. Secondly, the Finnish-Russian co-chairmanship of the OSCE Minsk Group also showed how Finnish diplomats expanded their competencies in European security politics. They learned to utilize multiple institutions to promote Helsinki's vision for a new European security architecture. The OSCE was simply an entry point and an institution that Finnish diplomats had experience working through. This allowed Finns to advocate for both an EU strategy on the Caucasus as well as Russia. An EU common strategy on Russia came to fruition during Finland's 1999 presidency of the EU Council. Last but not least, mediation in Nagorno-Karabakh significantly offered Helsinki a new view of Washington. Working intimately with the Americans gave Finnish diplomats an introduction to the complexities of American policy towards Russia, as well as the significance of oil politics in American foreign policy. It thus became apparent that Washington was an equal, if not bigger, challenge than Moscow. In building off this last point, and in making my second argument on the current limitations of European security historiography in the 1990s, I will make a short digression to discuss the Dayton Accords and peace mediation in Bosnia. In 1997, the US State Department published a book titled The Road to Dayton, US Diplomacy in the Bosnia Peace Process, May to December 1995. This was a result of a US State Department project titled the Dayton History Project. Bosnia and Nagorno-Karabakh were 2 parallel peace mediation and policy initiatives in 1995. By juxtaposing these 2 processes and asking why, as well as how, each has been written into the narrative of the 1990s, an interesting reflection arises on the state of contemporary and historiographical debates on European security. For the Dayton History Project, a historian, Derek Chalette, was given unfettered access in 1996 to classified US State Department documents, as well as broad interview access to the highest levels of US foreign policy decision-making. An unprecedented advantage in studying foreign policy history, only 1 year after the policy initiative, no less. The Dayton History Project is an example and an attempt by the US State Department to first and foremost create a comprehensive archive for future study. A second significant stated objective was to record best practices in successful American peace negotiations for future initiatives. Also in 1997, the Finnish Ministry of Foreign Affairs published Finland as a Mediator in the Karabakh conflict. This is a similar but much shorter text. The Finnish report was 30 pages, compared to the Dayton History Project, which was 270. Along with the Finnish report, an extensive archive was preserved in the Finnish National Archive and Ministry of Foreign Affairs Archive until a researcher might stumble upon them after a 25-year period of classification. The monograph I am defending here today is a peculiar reflection on the Dayton History Project. The Secret History of Dayton, as it was titled by the State Department, shows the power of the state in facilitating public debate on foreign policy history, but also the tunnel vision such access can bring. A key piece of the Dayton History Project was recording how to placate Russia in multilateral peace mediation environments. US officials believed that being able to successfully cooperate with Russia in multilateral peace mediation formats would be key for influencing Russian behavior in Eastern Europe and the post-Soviet space, as well as having Moscow accept NATO enlargement. These recorded best practices, while largely adhered to by the Finns in the OSCE Minsk Group, were seemingly forgotten in America's high-level mediation attempts in Nagorno-Karabakh. This was reflected when President Yeltsin told Strobe Talbot, US Deputy Secretary of State at the time, to stop telling the newly independent states that Russia was still the evil empire. This was paralleled by purported perceptions from Talbot that Moscow was ambivalent about the South Caucasus and that he could win the Nobel Peace Prize for his work on Nagorno-Karabakh peace mediation. The OSCE Minsk Group thus became a barometer of deteriorating Russian-American relations in a markedly non-NATO context. Nagorno-Karabakh mediation has remained hidden from the historiography of European security in the 1990s. failed policy initiatives are not often the histories states or decision makers want to be remembered for. Talbot ignores Nagorno-Karabakh in his memoirs. He avoids the question multiple times in oral history interviews conducted by the US State Department. And his personal biographer, when asked about Nagorno-Karabakh, didn't even know this was a region of the world that Talbot worked in. Therefore, if nothing else, the Finnish story of peace mediation in Nagorno-Karabakh allows us to question what we think we know about European security debates in the 1990s and why. Due to the hidden nature of historical traces from the American side, Nagorno-Karabakh peace mediation is a policy that needs to be studied from the Finnish perspective. This is where the comprehensive documentation lies. American diplomats who worked with the Minsk group are largely unwilling to speak on the record about the policy initiative. The only one who did, Ambassador Joseph Pretzel, did so 1 week before passing away. His testimony, once published, began to be quoted by other American retired diplomats as a way of saying what they could not themselves. While Bosnia as an American success is recorded, Nagorno-Karabakh as a failure is absent from the historical record. This dissertation attempts to begin countering existing narratives of the 1990s that have largely preserved the history of successful policy initiatives. The way in which we address the past also has implications for how we discuss the present as well as the future. Forgetting past failures has profound implications for how we debate policy in the present. Just think what American foreign policy would be without the memory of and extensive research on the Vietnam War. For example, the political debate in Finland on Finlandization or post-Finlandization would greatly benefit from academic historical analysis. Juhana Aunosloma asserted that, quote, "The better the understanding of the context in which the Finns operated in, both from the eastern and western sides, the less there will be need for polarization in the domestic debate," end quote. Finlandization is often polarizing, as we have limited research on the topic, and more so, it is a hard emotional concept to discuss. Few researchers are willing to put themselves in this political crossfire. Open debate, founded on credible academic research, is what is needed to come to terms with the Cold War past. Manchian worldviews of East versus West, while attractive, can support polarization. In adding to Aunosloma's argument, I believe we need a better understanding of how remembering, as well as forgetting, influences Finnish foreign policy debates. How a Cold War past is remembered, as well as forgotten, is an attempt to shape the current political moment. This is important in understanding how the parameters of contemporary foreign policy debate are managed. This is not unique to Finland. As shown, hard emotions also influence American foreign policy history. But due to Finland's progressive archival system, decision makers have less influence in hiding the past, though they still try. Historians thus have an unprecedented opportunity to develop contemporary Finnish foreign policy debates. History is considered a fundamental piece of foreign policy. Henry Kissinger argued that history was the most important subject any decision maker could study. I believe historians can play a role in regulating foreign policy debates and also motivating the public to engage in the present via the past. History does not necessarily offer lessons or regularities, but rather teaches us about possibilities. The past, according to Philip Zelikow, should be used to provoke curiosity in policy debates, something many policymakers have noted is lacking in contemporary discussions on the future of European security. For example, debates from the 1990s on constructing a multi-institutional approach to European security are debates many policymakers are only rediscovering now. Forgetting these past visions leaves us a step behind in creatively debating policy futures. The Finnish Institute of International Affairs' new director, Hiski Haukala, noted on Yle last month that, in his opinion, Finland's approach to peace in Ukraine has been morally correct, but unrealistic. This is a profound contribution to how we discuss Finnish foreign policy post-2022. In particular, it invites debate on a topic Finnish society has not wanted to entertain. What type of victory in Ukraine is plausible? This debate requires substantial critique of Ukrainian, American, and EU policy, as well as Finnish policy itself. Victory, just like peace, cannot be simply spoken into existence. Victory, as well as peace, requires long-term strategy and a multi-institutional approach. In my opinion, this includes constructing a strategy on Russia that is proactive, though founded on deterrence. In reaffirming the positive contribution of contemporary history, Aunosloma states, quote, "Increased understanding, knowledge, and arguments about our own recent past will broaden the possibilities for political action and strengthen democracy. But by relating the present to the past, the history of our own time expands what we can consider politically possible in the present," end quote. I would underline this point by saying that this must be done by discussing multiple, credible, and sometimes contentious pasts, society should remain critical of any past that is politically advantageous to any one group of political actors. As an oral historian, as well as international historian, I believe that meaning is made through ongoing interpretation. This requires a commitment to ongoing discussion. This monograph is by no means a final word. I only hope that it will be an inspiration for continued debate, and most of all, critical commentary. Honored opponent, Professor Jussi Hanhimäki, I now call upon you to present your critical comments on my dissertation.
Thank you very much. Just a before I start, a quick word of thanks for inviting me here to do this. It's always an honor. And my only disappointment is I was told that we cannot exceed 6 hours, and that's going to be tough, right? So, but we'll do our best. I'll read a brief opening statement, and then we'll sit down to discuss some of the fine points of the thesis. And this indeed is a very interesting research project that explores the immediate post-Cold War era, a period in recent history when a new world appeared to be in the making. More specifically, as noted, the dissertation explores Finnish, Russian, American peace mediation in one of the most highly controversial pieces of real estate in the post-Soviet space, the Nagorno-Karabakh region that was contested, continues to be contested, between Azerbaijan and Armenia. The focus is, of course, on a very specific period, 1995 to 1997, when Finland was a co-chair of the OSCE's Minsk group, set up to mediate a long-term solution, if possible, to this conflict. The mission, as we know, was not accomplished. But the point of the dissertation, of course, is actually not the specifics about the conflict itself, but how Finnish decision makers, diplomats, used the opportunity in a crucial moment in time to effectively reconceptualize Finnish-Russian relations to Finland's benefit as much as possible as the new post-war, Cold War European security structure was emerging. The focus of the research is particularly on Finnish diplomacy, and we will be discussing some of the findings here today, as much as 6 hours allows. So, but the thesis aims to make a contribution to understanding why, in the 1990s, the post-Cold War European security system was shaped the way it was. In other words, why certain institutions, most obviously NATO, prevailed as central to post-Cold War European security, while others, the CSCE, OSCE, the EU, and its CFSP, were relegated to the background. Why the CIS, the Commonwealth of Independent States, became what it seems to be have come a footnote in history. In effect, there are three issues addressed in the thesis. There's Finnish foreign policy and diplomacy. There's the mediation of the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh and the evolution of European security institutions in the early post-Cold War era. These, it's perhaps too obvious to stress, all carry a certain policy relevance in the present. Aside from the policy relevance, the thesis is timely as historical research, as it provides an important window to the possibilities of archival-based research on Finnish foreign policy in the 1990s. Not only is this kind of research only beginning to emerge, but the specific question, mediation in Nagorno-Karabakh 3 decades ago, is hardly known or remembered, as was already pointed out. And yet, the mediation occurred in a particularly important moment for Finnish foreign policy, a moment when the basic question of continuity and change related to almost every policy decision. Foreign policy and relations with Russia were a particularly sensitive field in a moment when the world had indeed been transformed. Just to note that in 1995, Finland joined the EU, and in December 1994, the CSCE had become the OSCE. Meanwhile, the United States had effectively cast its lot in favor of NATO enlargement as a consequence of the wars of former Yugoslavia, while the Russian Federation tried to keep the CIS together amidst many conflicts, such as the one between Armenia and Azerbaijan. In short, the way I approached examining the thesis itself was as though it's a window to an uncertain moment in which everything still seemed possible as far as the post-Cold War international system was concerned. Or at least this was a moment when the tensions and divisions that would characterize the European security system of the 21st century were not inevitable. A moment when Russia's relations with its neighbors, America's influence in Europe, and Finland's ability to find a role in the new Europe were not yet set on a path of no return, leading to Ukraine and all that has followed over the past couple of years. And so, in the next 5 or 6 hours, I'd like to go through some of the specifics, the nitty-gritty, if you will, of the work, the structures, sources, methods, and specific findings. Okay, I guess we can go ahead. So let me, what I'm going to try to do here is address a few things. It won't take 5, 6 hours, I'm sure. So, but maybe we, as one does in these occasions, like just quickly start with the very title of the thesis of the book, which you're all aware of. It's just the alternating visions of Europe's post-Cold War security architecture, subtitle Finnish, American, and Russian peace mediation in Nagorno-Karabakh, 1995-1997. And so what I want to ask you about very quickly is just the term alternating visions. I'm wondering if this means that every actor included in this had a specific yet different vision of Europe, or whether indeed Europe's post-Cold security architecture, or whether the visions of Americans, Russians, Finns, and others were indeed some kind of a totally open canvas, continuously changing on the pressures of the time. Was there something predetermined within the visions of any of the main 3 actors in your thesis?
Yeah, thank you. This is a good question. I think it's very pertinent too for the current moment. I would say the title was also an attempt to interact with kind of some of the existing arguments in the historiography. If we know Christina Spore's argument of the idea of kind of opportunity, but then a return to more conservative visions, conservative strategies of European security, or then Mary Sarate's argument that, you know, when there were new options or strategies pursued, there was a ratchet effect so that they couldn't go backwards. But I think maybe there needs to be a bit more flexibility in this, because there was, in my opinion, alteration within states, within discussions. This would be, in the Finnish perspective, the debate on kind of formulating stability policy and kind of what that entailed. So then you have the kind of the intellectual process that was begun, and then when it was taken up by decision makers, and then what it actually meant in practice. So you have the different levels of kind of thinking about European security, speaking about European security, and then implementing policy. And then, you know, as I think people who study decision-making would say that it's never one-to-one. There's always kind of variation from each step, and then there's also reflection. In the American context too, I think this is important. The big debate is on the politicization of foreign policy. And so I believe that you have said in your book on Pax Transatlantica that, in essence, it is part of the nature of democracy that leaders change, but national interests endure. And I think that Tony Lake, the national security advisor for Clinton, wrote many books, and then I believe in the 80s he published a book arguing about how American foreign policy had more continuity in the national interest in the 50s and 60s. And then Vietnam caused more politicization and then a change from administration to administration. I think we kind of see the uncertainty of that today. So this is also from the American perspective. You had the Bush administration, the Bush senior administration, who was proclaiming a Europe whole and free, and was somewhat, there's a debate in historiography about how significantly NATO enlargement was pushed and at different points, and then what the role of the CSCE was. You had James Baker, Secretary of State, promoting the CSCE as kind of maintaining this window to the east to allow greater integration. But then over time, this CSCE became more of a halfway house for countries that wanted to then join the EU and NATO. So it's kind of the conceptualizations continually shifted throughout the period. And they also shifted with administrations and political actors. So kind of there was an ongoing feedback loop, I suppose, for decision makers. And I think the interesting point is this is a period when there seemed to be more of this coalescence around conservative ideals of European security. So I think the early 90s is the Helsinki moment, or this idea that there was opportunity, but then once there was this feedback about the CSC being unable to stop conflict, or the EU unable to stop conflict in Yugoslavia, and then the hard security policy tools of NATO being needed, that was the feedback that then influenced kind of how these visions of Europe continued to develop, but then also kind of think what are the best aspects of these new institutions that might be able to retain some idea of coordination with the East, or kind of inclusion, so that there aren't new dividing lines. So.
Thank you. Let me follow this up with a sort of related question a bit, which is about the structure of the thesis. Because you're looking at here a very limited period of time. So it's 1995 to 1997, and the way the thesis is structured, it sort of goes, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and these talks took place. So it's a very chronological account about this particular moment in time. I'm just wondering if, in reflecting back on this, is there any alternative way of perhaps structuring this, this analysis rather than the way you've done? And if you, in fact, contemplated of doing it in a slightly different, more thematic, perhaps, manner or something like that. Also, I was going to compliment you on some of the subtitles, like "We go to the sauna," which is my favorite, obviously. When in doubt, go to the sauna, or something along those lines. But there's an awful lot of these these subtitles, and I'm just wondering if the logic behind this excessive subtitling, if you will. What is the logic there?
Yeah, thanks. It's a good point. I think this is my attempt at a very traditional diplomatic history. And to make it a more international history. The feedback that I received, like in my lectio, I commented on how American decision makers reacted in interviews, what they wanted to talk about, what they didn't want to talk about. And their main feedback was, you need to look at the American perspective from 1997 onward. So yes, if I were to restructure this, I think that I would try and expand some of the different actors and their perspectives. So expand research on the American perspective to kind of see the different temporalities in these alternating visions. That would be the first piece, because this is more or less, I don't know if this is fair to say, but a micro history of one diplomatic initiative in a very limited period. So it gives a cut in time of what Finnish diplomatic efforts were of a few Finnish diplomats in pursuing certain visions of Europe. And so that was, I think this is the foundation of that. But then if I really want to offer kind of larger conclusions, let's say, on the European security environment overall, then the Finnish story would be maybe an interesting piece that reflects on larger stories. But this would be kind of then looking at how this then motivated other initiatives in different time periods. or looking at different thematics. This could also be a way to organize it, thinking about institutions. So I think we have parallel researchers like Juha-Matti Ritvanen looks at NATO enlargement and the NATO question in Finland in the 1990s. And this is a very interesting reflection from a different institutional perspective, different actors, but kind of these similar ideas of thinking about, for example, in the Finnish context, what the Finnish national interest is, and then how it's reflected in documents, and then how it's implemented by different actors throughout the bureaucracy, and if there's continuity. So that might be one interesting thematic that would not necessarily be chronological, but could be comparative, and then you could then reflect on different time periods throughout.
Okay, so I think the other way of looking at this, because I mean, you're right, it is a very focused effort, and the research, the amount of specific documents on the specific question and the negotiations, they are quite, what you unheard, particularly from the Finnish archives, is quite impressive. But what leaves then to wonder about the bigger questions of this continuity and change, which you pointed out, in terms of Finnish foreign policy. I mean, if this is a snapshot of a particular crisis negotiation team involved in this particular process, how does that fit, I guess, in the bigger arc of history of Finnish diplomacy? Would there be, I mean, maybe you can comment a little bit on your perspective on the evolution more broadly of Finnish foreign policy in this regard. That, it's a post-Cold War, yes, but is it the end of the Cold War? How big of a break is it? There seems to be continuity among the actors to a large extent, at least in the sort of Finnish foreign ministry and who's there. Policymakers perhaps change, but what is, if you were to ask, what is the main continuity and what is the main change in terms of Finnish foreign policy, and how does your thesis somehow illustrate that in this regard?
Yeah, thanks. So one aspect of the question, if I can clarify, is how representative of is this example of larger change in continuity in Finnish foreign policy because of the limited scope of the initiative?
So does this tell us a bigger story about Finland in the post-Cold War world, so to speak, and does it, and if so, well, is it a major change from something? You mentioned interests and so forth. Are the interests more or less similar as they may have been in the, I don't know, the Kekkonen period or even before? So, is that?
Yeah, thank you. So I would say, how representative is it? I think this is an interesting question, and the point on how it represents change in continuity in Finnish foreign policy. I think it's significant, as I say in the work, because during the Cold War, Max Jakobsen wrote that Finnish diplomats tried tirelessly to separate Finland's operating environment in the Baltic Sea region from security developments in the the Warsaw Pact states and the Soviet Union. And so this was a very different thing because the rhetoric of this initiative was that if Russia will conduct relations by OSCE and UN norms in an area it considers significant to its security, the South Caucasus, then it's more likely to do so in the Baltic Sea region. So that was significant because it was directly tying Finnish security to security in other neighboring regions of Russia. How representative was this? I believe that, I think this again goes to the question of temporality, because at least you had President Ahtisaari participating in the initiative at the UN General Assembly. You had President Ahtisaari also proclaiming that this was the first example of Finnish crisis management as an EU member state, and then other members of the Finnish government at the time saying that Finland will do as much as possible to mediate conflicts in the post-Soviet space. So this was kind of, this then goes to the temporal question, is and kind of this idea of alternating visions is, was this mentality there in Finnish decision-making in 93, 94 that we see in traces or speeches in 96, 97? So obviously this is always very difficult in decision-making to prove causality, but the fact that it's directly stated in state speeches, I think is very significant. And I think I also say that it was a way to experiment. And this has been said by many scholars of Finnish foreign policy, that Finnish foreign policy experiments advantageously. So this can be seen as kind of an opportunity that was considered maybe low risk because of the period and Russia's perceived ability to kind of threaten Finland or Finnish sovereignty. But these were considerations at the beginning. I think you had Ambassador Newbery and Ambassador Mansala in Moscow contemplating what the impact on Finnish-Russian relations would be if the co-chairmanship went badly. And so that was a consideration. But the initiative also was pursued in various embassies. So this was tied to Finnish work in the UN, in Turkey, Iran, Brussels, Paris, the UK, et cetera. So there was coordination, and I think it did occur more broadly. And it was known, I believe, when Pertti Torstila was the head of the political department beginning in 96, he said that he knew that this was an initiative that was ongoing. So there's also the question of kind of, this is a bigger question too, I think, of Finnish foreign policy, is how much is known, because the Finnish bureaucracy, in my perception, is very different than, for example, the American bureaucracy in foreign policy, which I think is much more hierarchical, and you probably, you know a lot about. So this seems that there's more autonomy too, and so this also gives an interesting reflection on kind of how the national interest is formed and kind of the level of trust in foreign policy making, which is,
Okay, which sort of takes the other sort of broad set of questions I was going to ask had to do with the different actors, concepts, and so forth that revolve around the process that you've been studying. But maybe just before I go, if I can ask you two general questions just about this, because Nagorno-Karabakh is a very contested place. And you touched upon it a little bit in the talk about it in the thesis in the beginning. You touched a little bit in your presentation. I'm just wondering, I mean, what makes it? I mean, if there was an easy way of summing up, what makes this particular region, and we've seen again recent developments this last year, makes it such a contested place? And so that's one question. The other question is about the process that you study, which effectively would be right to say ends in a failure. That it is not a mission accomplished. And so, or is there something other than is it not so much actually about the conflict, but more about how Finnish foreign policy is perceived by others? Is it the kind of a branding exercise of sorts in this moment of possibilities, and you have a perfect cast of characters, including President Ahtisaari, who's known for his mediation and so forth. So, curiosity mainly: are Finns actually really interested in what comes out of the conflict, or is it a tool for something very different?
Yeah, thanks.
I'm putting you on a spot a little bit, given who's in the room, but that's okay.
Yeah. Well, I got out of the last part on larger questions of change and continuity in Finnish foreign policy, but I'll think about that. Yeah, I think that, again, I will use the American example here. When the U.S. entered Bosnia peace mediation, Madeleine Albright, who was then, I believe, the ambassador to the UN, was very critical that the Clinton administration was not active enough in mediating Bosnia, and that if the U.S. wanted to be kind of really the sole superpower in the 90s, or kind of what Hallbrands has called the unipolar moment, then they needed to take on peace mediation, and they needed to take on leadership for this. And so then historians then also argue that President Clinton, after the Dayton Accords, felt vindicated. He felt that he had confidence in foreign policy, and that then the US State Department and Defense Department both saw that peace mediation could be used as a tool to reassert American leadership in the world. And so first, maybe this is a reflection on larger discussions about the post-Cold War world and the unipolar moment, that you have American decision makers concerned in the mid-90s that they're not leading the world and that they need to do more to lead the world. Whereas it seems that, so far in scholarship, we more or less accept that America was leading the world for the entire decade. And I think that this is something that can be reflected on in thinking about unipolarity as context-specific and in different regions. So, using that to then answer this question, is peace ever about peace? I think it can be very beneficial. You saw that I think the Americans, at least, they might have a different perspective, but they're very open about talking about this. Ambassador Pretzel thought that if this went well, he would get a good ambassador position out of it. Strobe Talbot, as I said, others thought that he was very into it and thought he would get a Nobel Peace Prize for it. And then there was also the conception of, was he competing then with Richard Holbrooke as well? So for peace, and then kind of thinking about peace and reputation. So I think that's definitely a piece of it for any international actor, but it is something that is seen as beneficial and that is for the good of the international community. So I don't think I want to put a judgment on this necessarily, but I think that it's understandable that there's a certain reputation that's associated with peace, and that Finnish foreign policy, change in continuity, reputation has been a large piece of this. I think you have a lot of scholars, Louis Clare, Laura Ipatti, and people who research the image of Finland, and this has always been a piece of it, as well as kind of, again, this is this feedback of these different visions.
True, true, and you can go back to the whole peacekeeping thing in the Cold War period, and Finland is a peacekeeping superpower, and so forth.
If I can continue, this is just then the context as well is very significant, because you think about the actors, and if you have a diplomatic initiative where you work on a daily basis or monthly basis with colleagues, then it's going to develop relationships and gives you opportunities. It gives you, for example, this offered Finland various opportunities to interact with EU common foreign and security policy, which I've mentioned in the work, and this was also kind of an opportunity to show what this Finnish-Russia expertise meant as an EU member state in a new era. So it was kind of more of thinking about it as peace mediation, but also thinking about it as leadership and commitment to the international community. I think this is also a big piece is too when the Finnish co-chair team was thinking about passing off the initiative to other OSCE participating states. Some of the justifications were why some couldn't be chosen, whereas they had already committed their international responsibility. They had already fulfilled that. So there's this idea of kind of being a good member of the international community as well. And so this is also, I think, significant as well, and peace being something that maintains stability and the well-being of the international community.
Okay, good, thank you. Okay. Let me turn a little bit more about Finland, since we are on the topic. One of the, well, there's a couple of sets of things. I think we've already touched a little bit on the diplomats, on the and policymakers. But I'm just wondering, how would you? Because this, of course, is you made some reference to this about the sort of being a bit of an autonomy among the foreign service of Finland in terms of engaging with policy. But how would you look at these different roles of different institutions, different players in the making of this policy. And does this episode tell you something about the role, well, of the Foreign Service, of course, which is at the heart of it, but of the politicians? And of course, we have, sporadically we see mentions of Foreign Minister Halonen, for example. We have President Ahtisaari, but not all that much in the thesis itself. So if you can, maybe Prime Minister Lipponen, does he have any role in any of this, and so forth? Or does the diplomatic service really have a very outsized role in sort of in this process, that they independently shuttling back and forth and taking a sort of policy-making role that one might, if not in Finland, some other countries would certainly think that it would be elected politicians perhaps would have something to say, but they seem to play a relatively minor role in your thesis. So I'm just wondering if there's a reason for that other than the obvious fact that, well, your sources come from the foreign ministry for the main parts.
Yeah, thanks. This is a good point. And I have looked through the Finnish Parliament archives on this initiative, and there are some discussion of this in budget. For example, how many peacekeepers or civilian crisis management personnel would be seconded if the OSCE did offer some type of peacekeeping or observation mission, but it's seemingly largely functional. And I think this is maybe a reflection or representative of the time of kind of this period of change in Finnish foreign policy management, going from a more executive presidential management of foreign policy to kind of when the parliament started to take a more active role. I think this is also there's been argumentation in EU literature that the EU was important for kind of engaging parliament and having parliamentary participation in foreign policy. But this is, again, there's two pieces here of the change and continuity debate. There's what we see in official statements, and then what it actually is undertaken in practice. So kind of what are the old perceptions and working practices? Or I think I say this in the introduction as well as the doxa. So kind of what are the unspoken assumptions or operating practices, for example, here in foreign policy, that might not change as quickly as say, a policy statement. This would be, I think, Heikki Talvitie has said that even though Finland joined the EU in '95, nobody really knew what this meant at the time. So there's kind of a learning period as well for kind of what implementing policy means, even though when it's stated from a high level. And also it's a question of just responsibility and resources, which is always a question in Finnish foreign policy. I think Alpo Russi, who was in the presidential administration at the time, said that he was technically responsible for Nagorno-Karabakh in the presidential administration, but he very rarely looked at memos on the issue because he was so busy with other things. And I think especially former Yugoslavia was maybe more of a priority there. So then the President Ahtisaari would become involved when requested or when the mediating team wanted to raise the initiative. But I think this is also very interesting, comparing to the American context, which is the other context that I could compare in this, because, as I said before, the way in which foreign policy is implemented, so kind of the autonomy that was given to the Minsk Group team, and then to kind of pursue mediation policy. And I think this is why there's a decent archive. This is because there's documentation and validation of a lot of the initiatives that were undertaken, in an attempt to then present a foundation for the rationale for undertaking that. Whereas in the US perspective, you have so many different actors that are competing that it was hard, for example, for the State Department to actually manage mediation on a whole, because the National Security Council had a large interest in kind of shaping American policy via oil politics, because that was a large lobby at the time. And then I think also because of this, because of the role of the president in American foreign policy, one of my interviewees, William Hill, said that Clinton's foreign policy really depended on who talked to him before he went into a meeting. So there's kind of also this temporal aspect of how much continuity or strategy is there even in American policy. So I think a good example from the Finnish perspective is Ambassador Newbery. There was the big initiative on the Commonwealth of Independent States. And it was a very administrative battle or debate on should there be CIS participation in Minsk group meetings. And American, French, and I think German participants were very against this because this is a larger history of the way I interpret it, there's a larger history of the European communities not wanting to give diplomatic recognition to, for example, Soviet diplomatic bodies or the ECM, the European Council for Mutual Economic Cooperation. And then you kind of see this with the CIS as there wasn't an interest from diplomats to give recognition to the CIS because that was seen as kind of a Russian project to maintain the Russian Empire. But then there was also kind of, at the time, Newbery asserted that this was valuable because in mediation you need to have more of a human relationship than only administrative. And then you see the results of this 6 months later. High-level Russian diplomats thank the Finns for this, and that in effect it came out to nothing. They were never recorded in meetings, it appeared, and it was more of kind of this showing that there was an ability to work. But this was kind of thinking about that aspect as well as would that have been allowed in American foreign policy, where people who are engaging in mediation have to approve everything before they go through the process. And then this is the question is, there was conversation in Helsinki between, I think, the head of the political department at the time and Newbery about this initiative, and it was justified, and then it was pursued from the documentation that I see.
If I could just come back to the Americas in a minute, but if I could just stick with the Finns for a tiny bit longer. And one of the things that is sort of a bit missing from the thesis is the domestic context in Finland at this particular moment in time. And maybe you can say it's irrelevant for your thesis. However, it is a moment. There's an economic crisis in Finland in the early 1990s. There's this is in part due to the collapse of the Soviet Union and the loss of all that trade in the early 1990s. There's high unemployment, up to 20%. Just before this particular crisis lands onto things. So I'm just wondering how that's if the domestic political developments carry a role. Are they the reason why? Perhaps because there is so much domestic turmoil still in Finland in the mid-1990s. There's now a new president, first one elected through a direct election with Ahtisaari. And perhaps the whole policy process in Finland is so obsessed with recovery, economy, that perhaps allows a space for diplomats in the foreign ministry to indeed sort of run their own initiatives such as this. But more broadly, just the connection with the Finnish foreign policy and the domestic politics of Finland. And you touched in your lecture on the question of Finlandization, for example, which is one of those wonderful terms that we will never stop talking about and disagreeing on, but which clearly is all about foreign domestic sort of interference in that and how they affect each other. So just wondering in this, is there in this case any kind of connection? And if so, what?
Yeah, this is a very good question and something I hope to continue to research in future projects on kind of the role of civil society. For example, in the 1990s, when I was going through the National Archives, there's also a very good archive on Stete, which was more or less a pseudo-Finnish Helsinki Commission, and they promoted security policy debates in Finland and Nordic countries. and they were very active in the 90s, and they have a very comprehensive archive. That will be interesting to research to kind of offer reflection on what the role citizens groups played in security policy at the time. Yeah, this is a really good question because it's also the question of, it's an eternal question. I don't think it's only relevant for the 90s and domestic policy, but also today is, how do we talk about Russia? Russia still seems to be an initiative or an issue that politicians don't want to talk about for elections or don't want to debate the initiative. So this is also kind of, I think that maybe there was more latitude because this is an initiative that might not necessarily have been discussed as much. I mean, Helsingin Sanomat did report on it. So when Finland took up the chairpersonship, the chairmanship, there was an article in Helsingin Sanomat. There was also kind of articles about if Finland would support peacekeeping at the time. So this is also maybe a reflection too on kind of what are the safe narratives that can be discussed, kind of what are the templates that people know that they can engage in discussion, and that they there can be discourse. So if we think about kind of some of these different issues about kind of changing Russian behavior, this would be interesting for future research, is kind of, was this something that could have been discussed, or is these, because, you know, if we, from the reporting we see, we have peace mediation, we have peacekeeping, so those are the things that have been discussed previously, I think, in public discussion, in Finnish foreign policy. But yeah, this would be a very good piece for ongoing study, so thank you.
Okay, thank you. So let's go to the Americans for a bit. It's always great fun. And the U.S. makes a, relatively speaking, a sort of late entry into this, but then a rather forceful entry at one point, and it's a sort of sporadic. And you seem very critical, actually, about the role of the United States when I read this. So, can you know, why? I guess is the big why. Why are you critical? Do you think the Americans are responsible for, or the Clinton administration, the efforts basically responsible for the fact that the process doesn't succeed? That there is no real Helsinki moment that comes out of this peace mediation, but rather the conflict keeps going on and on and on. Or is it, some kind of a power play that the United States is making here? Because the unilateral moment that you mentioned. So, because the way some of the thesis seems to read is sort of echoes the idea that if you connect the dots, the way the United States behaves vis-a-vis Nagorno-Karabakh is sort of the way one strand of historiography says the Americans behaved with NATO enlargement, which is practically, too bad for Russia, but we are enlarging and therefore they're asking for it. I mean, there's that policy relevance going all the way to 2022 and so forth. But does this tell anything about, and when you refer to Mary Sorotis and others who discuss this, does this allow any window into that particular debate that connects NATO enlargement with the demise of the OSCE in effect, and hence the growing tension between Russia and what we still, for some reason, call the West, more broadly?
Yeah, thank you.
There wasn't a simple question. Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, but there's many good points there, and I can continue. I brought the American story into the Finnish question, so maybe I can bring the Finnish story into the American questions too. Okay. Yes. So I've thought about this as well. So you say in your Pax Transatlantica book that the transatlantic relationship is a great success story that is always on the brink of catastrophe. This is interesting to reflect on in this period, is to think about, one, how integrated is Finland into this transatlantic relationship? And so for me, this story is a bit of, it seemed about a bit opposite. This might be a bit grand to say, but it was but I think also in your work in the Finnish-US relationship in the post-war period, kind of thinking about what the Finnish-American relationship was, it was something else, maybe not a catastrophe, but it had the potential to be on a great success. So this is kind of thinking about, and then from this, then it goes also to networks. So thinking about with these relationships, I think this is also a larger story of kind of, from the American perspective, what do you do when, like, how do you actually make an ally, a new ally? This would be, if we think about Finnish NATO membership now, the story has been that Finland has developed NATO competencies over the past 10, 15 years or so, and that was very fundamental for Finland joining NATO, which is important. And so those are a lot of the relationships that have developed, and so I think this is kind of thinking about these relationships. I think Kari Möttölä has said he had a lot of these relationships earlier in the 80s, 90s, and then thinking about how these developed more slowly in the 90s, and then also today. I think you see this is kind of maybe a small example of this would be the whole discussion about Finland participating in which Joint Force Command in NATO in Brunnsummer and Norfolk, and then eventually being switched to Norfolk, and then in the Finnish embassy in the US they have the ROCs that are F-35s, and they invited a lot of security policy people as a form of kind of developing these networks. But in the 1990s, it seemed that the US and Turkey had much stronger connections and cooperation in sharing information and kind of their true intentions. And then in the Finnish side, it seemed that the Finns and then their networks in Moscow, they were able to more openly talk about this. So this is when we think about kind of why am I critical of the Americans? I think that there was so many issues going on at the time that American foreign policymakers had to manage. This was, you had UN action in Haiti, you had kind of trying to assess loose nukes in the post-Soviet space, you had Rwanda, you had Yugoslavia, and you had all of the plethora of arms control initiatives, and then the US-Russian agenda. So this was just kind of such a small issue for a period that you would have high-level people like National Security Advisor Sandy Berger going out to the region for a week. And then this would be kind of after that week, then American decision makers would think that, okay, that was appropriate. And then you even have Newbery saying in cables that, American analysis on the region is not pertinent. And then that was why it was seen as necessary to kind of push back against this. So there's also the question of how much time was committed to the initiative. Was it sufficient? And then did it lead to proper policy and proper analysis? The biggest issue too is you see kind of when the peace mediation was attempted to be raised to head of state level at the 1995 UN General Assembly, I believe. There was perceptions that President Clinton made some type of proposal for peace that was not shared with other Minsk Group members. And so this is kind of also, I suppose, why I'm critical, because a large rhetoric of the period coming from Washington and Helsinki was that you need to teach the Russians how to play by the rules of the game and also how to engage in international mediation, because collective effort is kind of the rule of the day. But then at the same time, you would have kind of American initiatives that weren't shared with Finnish colleagues, and this was then kind of a reflection on American unilateralism that then didn't succeed. So if it would have succeeded, it might have been a very different story. But now we have this, it didn't succeed, and we have a different reflection. And then there were multiple months afterwards where there was ambiguity about what this was. And then the Russians would then tell their Finnish colleagues about how upset they were, and this kind of led to a deterioration of mediation, is that the Finnish mediation team more or less built a working mediation format in the first 6 months of mediation. And then when the Americans got engaged with President Clinton, then the Finns had to transfer a lot of their efforts to managing this growing conflict, because the Russians more or less had said for the first 6 months after Budapest, when the US put NATO enlargement on hold until Yeltsin would be reelected in '96, that, okay, there was a semblance of cooperation at least. You saw it in Bosnia, and then you saw it in Nagorno-Karabakh. But then you had kind of these perceived peace proposals by Clinton that weren't shared in multilateral forum with other partners, that then this really concerned the Russians and kind of led to them pushing back and, again, being a stronger gatekeeper and producing their own unilateral peace mediation in the region. So this was kind of, the critique there is kind of thinking about were these actions thought through from the American side? And then it seems that they might have been post-97, when more effort and resources were applied to the conflict. But then this again goes to the temporalities of the European security environment. Is 97 was kind of, you had already a beginning of this re-solidification of conservative views of Europe, and then peace mediation might not have been as effective in these regions. You had these dividing lines reappearing. So it's, again, this temporality. And then, yeah, so this goes back, final point, to your question on peace. And I think the temporality of peace needs to be considered here. Is that, I think, in my opinion, if the US would have had the resources and engaged at a high level in the first 6 months of 1995, or if the second half of 95 would have gone differently, that there could have been more opportunity for a resolution or progress. Because there were perceptions from many actors in early 1995 that a peacekeeping operation or some type of peace agreement or a political agreement could be produced, at least by the end of the year. But by the end of 95, then the timeline started to shift to 97, so on.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. Is, on the United States, would it be safe to say that maybe even more so than with what I suspect with some of the Finnish policy, but again, the conflict, the Nagorno-Karabakh, is not so. I imagine many American policymakers and certainly the general public would never find a place on the map. Right? The old joke about Vietnam and so forth. But in this case, I'm sure that's very much the case. So it's never a big public issue. And so any U.S. involvement in this, it seems to me, I mean, this is sort of a mixture of hubris, I think, the unilateral thinking we are indispensable, the famous quotes from both Clinton and Albright and so forth. And so it must be about something else. It's not about making peace. It's about creating, signposting, signaling that, the United States can, in a week, fix things if need be. So this may be more of a general comment, but if that, does this, in a sense, teach you anything about the United States and its foreign policy priorities in this particular moment in time? Because it is a critical. The 1990s we still don't fully understand. But was there any kind of sort of clear-cut plans, or is it the temporality, things happen, and you do it on the go? Is there a grand strategy? I guess that's what I'm basically asking. Or was there one ever?
Yeah, thanks. This is a very tough question.
I'm not expecting yes or no. So
but it's a good question. Yeah. I think you had a lot of competition, too, within the U.S. administration at the time.
And of course, just to add a little extra twinkle, 1996, of course, is election year, not only in Russia, but in the United States.
Yeah.
So that probably makes
Yeah.
a certain, another peace agreement would be nice.
Yeah.
A feather in the cap.
Yeah. Yeah.
If not, then.
Yeah. I don't think there was necessarily a grand strategy. You saw that Clinton, when in the election in '92, the large debate was on decreasing defense spending after the Cold War and also kind of disengaging from Europe. So there seemed to be more of an isolationist trend. Even in Clinton's, nobody thought foreign policy would be an issue in the '92 election. And Clinton himself commented more on the CSCE as a priority for American foreign policy in campaign speeches than NATO. But then you see that kind of Tony Lake and others push this through, and in 94, 93, end of 93, 94, it kind of becomes more prominent in American foreign policy. But you still have people in the administration or in the State Department, such as Talbot, who kind of continue to argue that there needs to be continued CSE-OSCE policy to create an environment where NATO enlargement can occur. That this is significant. But then Talbot himself comes out in the New York Review of Books supporting NATO enlargement. So this is also kind of thinking about this as from the strategic, maybe bureaucratic perspective. But at the same time, in Nagorno-Karabakh, this is where kind of the whole question of business interests come in oil. You have the Secretary of Energy and the Deputy Secretary of Energy both engaging with Russian counterparts and traveling to the region in support of American oil companies. You had Brzezinski, who the former national security advisor and was now working for AMCO, or he would work in the future for AMCO, but he was an advisor for Clinton and submitted personal letters from Clinton to President Aliyev with proposals for a peace agreement that America would support. That wasn't apparent at the time to the Minsk, the Finnish or other Minsk group members, and he would do so traveling on AMCO, American oil company jets. And so this is also, you had other prominent Democratic Party funders who were Armenian or supporting oil interests, who would then lobby the Clinton administration. And then you had this dynamic where the NSC was considered to by and large be supportive of oil interests, except for certain people like Sheila Heslin, who was in the NSC, and she was responsible for this region. And she was, for example, the San Francisco Times said she was the last Girl Scout in the NSC because she was the only one still willing to push back against oil interests. And then you have interviews from that I've done with American NGOs who worked in the region in the period. And they said that, you know, for example, the American ambassador to Kazakhstan at the during the period drove a Land Rover with a bumper sticker that said, "Happiness looks like 2 oil pipelines." So this is kind of thinking about what is the role of business interests in American foreign policy, especially in this period. What was the role of other actors in countering this? In the State Department, Joseph Pretzel said that he couldn't get involved in oil politics because 100 people in Washington would want his head. So he had to focus solely on mediation. And when these larger interests came up, or when the White House or NSC did get involved, he had a very difficult position to play, or role to play, because you know, this is again going back to the question of peace. Is even if he had an interest in peace, he knew what his role was in the American bureaucracy, and he knew the conflict, and he had to try and kind of play this and survive. I think then, as a result of this, he ended up being sent to Absentia in Uzbekistan as ambassador of Uzbekistan. So this is, yeah, so I don't think there was a strategy, and I think that this is a larger question about the unipolar moment, which I brought up, is that this example pre-97 shows the inability of America, even if it was the sole superpower left, if that's what we want to say, if we say America was the strongest player in the international system, that still didn't mean they had the ability to resolve any conflict in any region of the world if they wanted to. So I think it's important to consider the limitations and also the policy areas as well.
Yeah, no, it's great, thank you. I appreciate that. Let me turn to the third main actor quickly, which is Russia, which it seems to me you had, which it's kind of important in the story. And a few questions. Obviously, you did not have the same kind of access to materials and so forth. It's very difficult to conceive such access these days. It seems to me that there's a very straightforward line of argument that you follow here in terms of how the Russian optics or position sort of evolves from what seems to be, okay, CSE, cooperative security, things of that nature, to a much more nationalistic, this is, CIS is a real thing, it's the post-Soviet space, but it's really the Russian space. Sort of more protective attitude, or not protective, a sort of almost ownership of this particular region. So I'm wondering, is sort of more and more sort of defensive and territorial, and perhaps in part pushed by the United States and its role. But just wondering, is there anything you can, based, from what you were able to discover here, that would give us some sign in terms of whether this really is just reactive to outside pressures and push and interest, or is there, and this goes to the continuity and change kind of thing, or is it more of a sort of ingrown continuity about protecting what are seen as important national symbols of prestige, of influence, of ability to push. And you talk about Yeltsin's re-elections, for example, as a sort of moment of transformation in terms of where the more nationalistic elements become evident. So I guess it also raises the other question, which has to do about domestic and foreign policy, which we already touched upon. But I'm just wondering, in terms of Russia, is there any surprise here actually about Russia and its role and how it evolved over the 95-97 period?
Yeah, how the role evolved. Thanks. I think we see that the development of Russian foreign policy in this period was kind of the end of these Atlanticist hopes, at least, and then you had more of kind of this Eurasianism, Yeltsin coming out and supporting kind of Russia having a special role in providing peace and stability, or having a special role in just overall in the post-Soviet space. Kind of, I think in his biography, or in his memoirs, Yeltsin says that he was obliged to respond to the people because he was such a Democrat, that these were what the people wanted. So he was framing it like this, but I think this was more of kind of, you saw in Duma elections that this red-brown coalition of nationalists and communists kind of continued to grow with discontent about economic change, etc. And this was, a problem that framed at least U.S.-Russian interactions in the space. Clinton was often chided for having a Russia-first policy. I think this was Bob Dole who said this. And then this was also the general commentary, is that the U.S. would focus on Russia at the expense of other independent states. So this, in a sense, may have facilitated this kind of, and in many other European countries, this was a debate at the time, is I think a lot of former Warsaw Pact states saw this as very pertinent, is that even though, for example, Poland and other countries wanted to join NATO in the late 90s, as they were part of this process, they still understood that the OSCE needed to be invested in, because this was a way to maintain focus on these regions. Because if you only focused on NATO, then you lost a whole aspect of Russia policy that was very significant. And then this was, again, going back to the line of dividing lines. You had the NATO Secretary General, Manfred Warner, at the time, saying that Partnership for Peace and all of NATO's policy was to create an environment where the CSE and OSCE could function more effectively. And then you had also the CSCE Secretary General at the time saying that, and the same with many European states, that you couldn't have this rhetoric of saying that Russia was going to reassert a sphere of influence, but then do nothing to support the newly independent states, because this was a big piece at the time, is where would the funding be? I think the European Union was the main aid provider to the South Caucasus in the 1990s, and Wolfgang Ischinger said that the EU more or less kept all three republics moving, and that they were feeding the Caucasus. But then there was this inability from the EU to actually translate this into leverage for democratic transition or peace mediation. So there was a lack of strategy there as well, because the EU was only developing common foreign and security policy competencies. So this then is the question of the feedback. If Russian decision makers saw that there was this kind of inability, lack of interest, kind of half-hearted support for these regions. They were the ones who needed to promote stability because these were the regions that would create instability in Russia. You saw the South Caucasus was seen as significant for kind of radical Islam in some of these questions, and the flow of drugs and arms. And so instability was a large question at the time. And this was also American decision makers kind of saw it as best to leave it to the Russians. So there's this kind of ambiguity about how to resolve these problems. There was much more discussion, and this was the focus of discussion for continental Europe and Yugoslavia, and that was a hard enough problem. So then a lot of decision makers just kind of didn't have the ability to focus on solving these problems or the knowledge at the time. And this was kind of, I believe Moscow had some of these competencies, and so this was a larger question of, it was thinking about this as a policy issue. But I take that this is, the changes in Russian policy. It became, and then you had Yevgeny Primakov as well, who was then the intelligence chief, who then became the foreign minister. And this was a big influence as well, because Yeltsin at the time had a lot of hard issues, and then so foreign policy more was increasingly kind of, there were different actors who were managing foreign policy. But, yeah.
So to understand, I mean, 1990s Russian foreign policy, I guess, in terms of, for those more present-minded, we think about Putin's Russia, and it has a certain kind of political system and so forth. But going back to the 1990s, in which today it seems the Russian foreign policy is very directed from at the top, and that's the end of it. 1990s, it seems to me what you're arguing here is based, or what you assume at least here, is in terms of the institutions and the sort of lines of command or hierarchies and so was much more fluid. Yeltsin was not really in charge. That there was perhaps, in terms of to understand the rise of certain kind of nationalism within Russia in the 1990s, it's really coming from the bottom up in a sense of the political system. Would that be correct, or?
I think that influenced. You had a lot of people who were former military. You had a few former military officers who participated in, for example, the First Chechen War, who then were elected and were very vocal about the South Caucasus and Nagorno-Karabakh in Russian foreign policy. And they were arguing against kind of this duplicity in Russian foreign policy, that you can't support autonomy in some regions and then not in others. So kind of there was an increased discussion, I suppose. So it was also this opportunity of Russia experimenting with the democratic foreign policy, maybe. But then this was the irony, is that a lot of American politicians and decision makers then had to reflect on kind of, especially in the 96 election campaign, when Yeltsin was running for re-election and his approval ratings were dismally low. I think when they began, it was something like 3%. Is, do we really want to support this type of democracy that then might lead to Zhirinovsky or someone becoming president? And then Clinton would say in meetings with Chirac that we can't have these people coming to the G7 or the G8. So this is why you need to support Yeltsin and offer these loans. So I think that's also a piece as well. I think a big piece too on Russian foreign policy that I also might not bring up as much in the work that's interesting is also to think about what role the newly independent states, in this case Armenia and Azerbaijan, actually played in this, and kind of how they interacted with Moscow, and then how they shaped Russian foreign policy, if they had an influence, and then if they had an influence on Finnish foreign policy or American foreign policy as well. You see that they had a lot of strategies to kind of play the mediators off each other, kind of to advocate for their own interests. And I think this is something that's mentioned in the existing literature very broadly. But this is also kind of thinking about this is, for example, when Russia did initiate unilateral peace mediation in '96, kind of when this more nationalist foreign policy was coming about, I think Newbery said that Kazimierov, the Russian mediator, would travel to the region without consent, without common understanding from all Minsk group parties, and it was said to be kind of that as the uncle traveling to the region to remind the parties of their mortality. And so this is kind of thinking about this hierarchy. And even after this US initiative, the Armenia and Azerbaijan, they continued to kind of play, they were uncertain. And so they kind of hedged their bets about who to interact with and kind of who was the real leader of the Minsk group, and this influenced. So you kind of have this environment where these smaller states, even in the newly independent states, aren't able to fully pursue their own sovereignty because of these larger level issues and these shifts in the system. So I think that's also something that's important to think about.
This is the point of the CIS, right? Is in a sense, I mean, to cite the old thing about NATO, about keeping Americans in and Russians out and Germans down. I guess the point of CIS is to keep the neighbors down, Russia in and the Americans out. And that's the point of the CIS, right?
Yeah, but you can see through this initiative even that, for example, Aliyev was able to kind of use this to their advantage. For example, when the original ceasefire, I believe in '94, was agreed, that they required that it be signed in the region. And oftentimes the leaders would say that they didn't want to sign agreements in Moscow because Moscow wanted to have these talks titled the Moscow talks and have all signatures done there, but kind of this was their opportunity. And then I think Aliyev also negotiated with, or he was advised by Vice President Gore and Madeleine Albright that he should hold out against the Russians until he could get a better deal. So there's also this question of kind of them, these actors understanding their positionality and kind of trying to navigate these structures as well to create their own autonomy or to create their own favorable domestic circumstances, let's say, for re-election.
Yeah. So I don't want to go and ask about election interference. That's a different ring to it, but you know. Okay, listen. There are many other actors involved in piecing together the story of this conflict, and I was wondering if you could maybe just very briefly comment on some references to the EU. So I was wondering, when you say the EU, the obvious question is, well, what is the EU? And Henry Kissinger, you mentioned, couldn't find the phone number for the EC, and I'm not sure if people still can, but in this context, of course, this is the new EU, which is emerging with the CFSP and so forth, and yet it seems to me the key players are national players in that context, France and Germany in particular. And so is their role, and France obviously then emerges as one of the co-chairs later on after 1997, but if you could say maybe something about the French role. And then the last actors that I would like you to comment upon is well, it's the Azerbaijanis and the Armenians, which sort of, the way this seems to piece together, this is a conflict. That it's a diplomatic game played by others. But there is a real conflict in this real region. And you made a little reference here that they're trying to, Armenians and so forth, trying to influence the negotiators. So I was wondering if you could maybe also provide an example of that. Three questions.
An example of how they tried to influence mediation.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So on the EU, yeah, this is a difficult question, especially in this time period. If you're looking at the context of common foreign and security policy developing, and kind of the ability, you had the different tools developing as well. So I think it was common positions were relatively new at this period, and then common strategies came later in the 1990s. But this was seen in kind of the Council was very active in kind of promoting this discussion, and then it would be the EU Council that would kind of decide on if there should be a common position and then if it should be implemented. So on this, there was the common strategy for the Transcaucasus, was the title of a commission report, and the Finnish Minsk Group team worked very actively with the EU Commission because the EU Commission was the body responsible for distributing grants through and technical assistance to the region. And so they had a role to play and an interest because of their programs as well. And through this initiative, I think the Finnish Minsk Group team learned more some of the politics of the council. So this was learning to have the council presidency supporting your initiative, and kind of this would be, it came to be seen that within the Minsk Group, if France and Germany would commit effort and focus on the region, then that would be a positive. That would then lead to larger EU engagement, or at least it would remain a significant issue on the agenda. And so this is important as well, because thinking about kind of EU politics and engagement more generally, it's been said informally among diplomats more contemporaneously that the French co-chair was kind of the EU representative. If this is accurate or not, I think it's more symbolic, but this was a large initiative as well. And then also this came up in peacekeeping discussions. But this then makes this whole question of who the EU was more complex, because in the period you had the Western European Union, where any discussions about peacekeeping or peacekeeping decisions should be made through the Western European Union. And this was a whole nother layer of institutional politics for the EU. So initially, the Finnish Minsk Group team attempted to promote peacekeeping discussions with French and German colleagues, and then there was discussion of Nagorno-Karabakh in the Western European Union, but it largely fell off. And so it was kind of seen that this was not a possible avenue at the time. So I think this was also, the EU was shifting at the time from the perspective of who do you interact with if you want to engage in EU politics, specifically EU common foreign and security policy, and then even more specifically on EU foreign and security policy on the post-Soviet space. And so kind of finding those allies and creating those networks again was, I think, a piece of this as well. Armenia and Azerbaijan, other examples. Okay, so on this proposed peace initiative. So this is a hard part too, because American interviewees didn't want to call it a secret peace initiative. They wanted to say, well, it could have happened, but then there's clear documentation that the Armenians they perceived that America was having its own peace mediation efforts outside the Minsk Group. So when you had President Ter Petrosyan of Armenia talking with Strobe Talbot and I believe Jim Collins, maybe, or Sandy Berger, Petrosyan says, we see that there are three parallel initiatives going on. There's the Minsk Group, there's the American initiative, and there's the Russian initiative. And this was a meeting that occurred 30 minutes after the Russian mediation team and deputy foreign minister had come to Armenia to speak with them. So they had back-to-back meetings with these high-level delegations, and they were receiving different peace proposals. And so the Americans would then, this was at the same time when the Americans were telling the Finns that there's no parallel American initiative, there's only the Minsk Group initiative. But the Armenians kind of were the ones who were the most suspicious, and they had the most to lose, because they would not, like an oil deal would not be good for them. So they had to kind of navigate this, and they also had to kind of try and gain support. And so you see some of this in the Finnish-Armenian relationship as well. And so this is also interesting, is how the different players interacted with the different actors in the mediation format, depending on how much each mediator might or might not know. But at the same time, they didn't want to present all the information. So that's, I think, as information is very important in diplomacy, I think that's kind of the card they had at the time, because other than that, they had the territory that they had taken through the war. But more or less, as we've seen over the last 30 years, Azerbaijan had a lot of leverage and kind of was developing kind of to think about when they could use their moment.
Okay, let me, I have last set of questions really, and this will probably be relatively brief. I just wanted to touch a little bit on your methodology and sources and things of that nature. And like, I guess it's fair to say this is a sort of a traditional history in many ways. You have identified the archives, you've done some interviews. It's a qualitative research. You're not counting and making models from your data set and so forth. So there's not sort of much of an interdisciplinary effort here, it seems to me. You can correct me if I'm wrong. But on the sources, sorry about yes, thank you. On the sources themselves, I must commend you on all the materials you found especially in the Finnish Foreign Ministry archives and so forth. I am, of course, as any historian, always asking, well, what did he miss? And so if there are sources that you, whether Finnish or others, that would have been useful. In particular, that would have shed more light, perhaps, on the policy-making process within Finland, but also on the diplomacy itself, on the different relationships. And I'm wondering if, given your chosen data set, and given that you have also conducted a number of interviews particularly with Finnish diplomats, policymakers, were you conscious of potential bias that might come from those particular sources, from those interviews, and how did you think any of that had, influenced? Just sort of basic question. How do you separate being a researcher and then being bombarded by people involved in the process you're studying? And I'm sure the Finnish Finns that you were able to interview had certain memories that maybe at times, perhaps they even contradicted some of the archival sources. So I'm just wondering how that all worked out in practice. And if there's anybody you would have liked to have interviewed, but you were unable to do so. I'm sure there are many of those.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, so the initial conception of this project was that it would be both memory politics and international history. And then the way it turned out was there was this traditional diplomatic history, and then I used more of my interviews for different articles on thinking about kind of oral history in foreign policy research. So I think that's, it's a good point. And it's a very difficult task to kind of, how do you weave in different methods when doing international history, even if you are considering it new diplomatic history. This is the traditional perception of political historians that interviews create color in the narrative or kind of fill in gaps where the archives aren't. I think that's important, but it to an extent also gives power to the interviewees to kind of tell their stories, which is important. And I think that doing interviews with Americans as well as Finnish diplomats was one way to kind of think about this. And then a lot of the American, I think William Hill, when I interviewed him, he said that this was, the work that I've done is very different from his perception of the period, but that doesn't mean it's wrong. It's just because as a decision maker, you only have a slice of reality at the time as well. You have access to more information, but it's still limited. And so this is always a question of perspective. So yeah, I think it's still a task and it's still a challenge that hopefully I continue to research in the future. And I think this is kind of, we've thought about this as well on how to engage history politics and memory politics more in the study of foreign policy and its significance. But again, I think this goes away from this traditional structure that you critiqued in the beginning of this discussion, which I think is appropriate. But then again, it also allows you to ask different questions if you don't have this traditional narrative or this traditional chronology. For example, the domestic context. Even through this discussion, I can see that the availability for domestic debate that I could follow with open source material or archives in the US and Russia on this topic was much broader. So there was just an opportunity to kind of fill in these debates and be aware of kind of what the different policy relationships were. In Finland, this is also very interesting because there's the question of, okay, if this was the focus, if I focused on this more, I tried to pick up as much domestic politics as possible. The one question is open source. There's the ALIN archive, which is very good, but this is also very high-level state decisions. If we're thinking about kind of newspapers, Helsingin Sanomat, we have, I've seen some projects that students have done about kind of how Helsingin Sanomat covered the OSCE in the security policy debates at the time. And kind of it seems that some of the discourses on, well, there's commentary that was the CSE is important, but you know, should there be more consideration of the UN or the Western European Union or other institutions as being more functional at the time? And so this is also an interesting thought, is how accurate is security policy reporting in any country? And then how do we consider this as historians, as representative? So I think that's one piece as well, and going back to this discussion about how different domestic contexts discuss foreign policy, and then what the limitations are. So that would be that piece. Yeah, and who I would have interviewed. There were many people who said no. And there are many people who have only come out and said they would do interviews later. So this is also a consideration, is thinking about when you do an interview. So we think about this a lot in oral history, is kind of timing is very important. And then who is allowed to speak, and then how this then influences the narrative and the traces you find in which direction you go in. So there's a lot, I think, in the methodological considerations that I didn't write in to the dissertation, but I think that kind of create the overall context in which you do the analysis and how you interpret the documents. But I think this is more of political scientists are probably better at kind of explaining all of this, and historians maybe not so. So this is also a point for future research is, do I want to continue in doing traditional historical research in this way, or do I want to try and do something different?
It's sort of leads to the last question I had, and then question which you sort of now alluded to, which is because there's, because you know, research is the end of it all, right? So hopefully, and I'm just wondering what you know. First of all, is the conclusion here roughly that in this, what your thesis at one level shows or illustrates is the death of the OSCE as a significant institutional pillar of post-Cold War European security? If so, you know, maybe there is more to it than the question of Nagorno-Karabakh, and so that could be one direction of travel in terms of future research, or you know, or something else. I mean, this may be something that's not entirely appropriate for our meeting here, but if you want to say a few words of that would be fine.
Yeah, thanks. I don't know if it necessarily meant the death of the OSCE. But I think it was more of kind of the positioning of it is, this is the discussion we have now, is what is the added value? So kind of thinking about what the relationship is. So thinking more about, I think there's maybe not the death of the OSCE, because that is the premise of that would be that there is one primary security institution. And I think that maybe is the flaw of the current discussion, is that you lose a lot if you don't consider all the tools that you have. And it also is the directionality of policy. Different institutions direct policy in different regions. And so this is, again, the larger question of what will the future be if you continue to leave a lot of these smaller states that live in the gray zone to fend for themselves. If you just accept that, okay, this is kind of the irony, or maybe, yeah, the irony of the whole discussion of decolonizing Russian studies, and then the parallel policy discussion of only focusing on deterrence in continental Europe, is scholars should decolonize Russian studies and Eurasian studies, but policymakers, are they ready to also engage in doing this from a policy project perspective? And I think that's kind of where there's might be continued disconnect.
Okay, shall we start with this? So I make my closing statement. Bradley Reynolds' dissertation explores the complicated nature of post-Cold War European security system through a very specific set of spectacles by focusing on the peace mediation efforts connected to the Armenia-Azerbaijani conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh. His chosen time frame, 1995-1997, and the main vantage point is that of Finnish diplomats and Finnish diplomacy. The main research question of the thesis reflects this. How did Finnish decision makers reconceptualize Finnish-Russian Cold War relations to try and shape post-Cold War European security structures to Helsinki's benefit? Reynolds addresses this question by carefully analyzing the OSCE's Minsk group during the time that Finland was the group's co-chair. While the focus is on Finland, however, Reynolds also engages with other key actors, Americans and Russians in particular. The role of key European nations, especially France and Germany, also addressed in the discussion of the various proposals and deliberations that made up the OSCE's Minsk group's efforts to find, unsuccessfully, as it turned out, a solution to the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. Indeed, 3 decades later, the region remains highly volatile following Azerbaijan's attack and the flight of ethnic Armenians from the region after September 2023. This is therefore not a dissertation that focuses on a successful conflict mediation. Rather, the dissertation is about diplomatic maneuvering in a moment when existing structures of European security were modified in a rapidly changing international environment. Indeed, one of the important and specific points about the thesis is that it clearly shows the multiple complex challenges and possible dangers that were connected to Finland's mediation efforts in this conflict in the post-Soviet space. As a new EU member looking for a new Helsinki moment, the efforts of Finnish diplomats in the Minsk group were, as Reynolds shows, more about positioning Helsinki in a favorable way at a time framed by America's unilateral moment and Russia's shift towards a more nationalistic, even imperialistic policy vis-à-vis its so-called near abroad. The methodological approach of the dissertation is well justified for the task at hand. Reynolds has made full use of a wealth of sources. Central to the thesis is a host of previously unused primary materials from Finland, the US, the EU, the UN, and the OSCE. Reynolds makes his mastery and knowledge of the relevant literature clear in the thesis and shows an ability to converse not only with historians, but political scientists, lending the dissertation an element of interdisciplinarity. The thesis further benefits from oral history interviews with key Finnish diplomats like René Nyberg, Heikki Talvitie, and others, as well as diaries and newspapers. All in all, for a dissertation that focuses on Finnish foreign policy, the sources are clearly the appropriate ones. There were 2 minor shortcomings that, while they do not negate the many positives of the dissertation, bear perhaps mentioning. First is the inevitable consequence of Reynolds' careful reliance on primary sources. The reader is served a menu of meetings and memos that provide much detail and texture at the cost of somewhat undermining the visibility of the big picture in the story, the major arguments. Second, we learn somewhat too little about the actual conflict of Nagorno-Karabakh and the actors that make policy for Azerbaijan and Armenia. While this is justified on the basis of the thesis' focus on the Minsk group and Finnish diplomacy, it does leave one wondering of the severity and the reasons behind the longevity of this particular conflict in the post-Soviet space. This said, the dissertation clearly stands out as a well-crafted and carefully researched examination that raises further possibilities for meaningful research. At the moment when much has been said about NATO enlargement and the ongoing war in Ukraine, Reynolds calls attention to the relatively paucity of research on the so-called post-Soviet space. Indeed, the broader significance of this thesis is to highlight how the various processes underway in the 1990s did not inevitably result in the imperfect European security structure that ultimately has emerged. By inserting the perspective of a small country like Finland into a narrative that is dominated by American and Russian, and to a lesser extent, big European powers like France and Germany's policies, Reynolds has shed light on the multiple different roads that could have been taken. This included a more pluralistic, perhaps OSCE-focused system of European security. Ultimately, of course, Finland, like others, were looking for security and stability. Finnish diplomats were trying to, in the words of one Henry Kissinger, rescue choice from circumstance. The preferred choice was the OSCE. That having effectively failed, the efforts and the policies evident at the Minsk Group became the foundations of the 1999 Northern Dimension Initiative for the EU. This Finnish choice reflected the way in which the country could effectively punch above its weight by highlighting Helsinki's historical relationship with Moscow. While there was no Helsinki moment in terms of a peaceful solution for Nagorno-Karabakh via the Minsk Group, the Finnish co-chairmanships offered a moment to clarify the limited choices that the particular circumstances of the 1990s allowed. Because of its narrow temporal focus, the dissertation cannot overhaul our understanding of Finnish foreign policy. It cannot fully explain why the OSCE was relegated to a much more limited role as a security actor in the post-Soviet, post-Cold War era. But Reynolds has made a significant contribution to the historiography of Finnish foreign policy on the one hand, and the importance of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict mediation to the overall evolution of Russian-American relations on the other hand. Most importantly, the dissertation highlights the sheer need for historians to look beyond the issue of NATO enlargement in order to understand the evolution of the post-Cold War European security system. And these are, of course, points of departure for further research. No book is the final word on anything, no definite studies ultimately exist. What we have is a growing series of contributions that aim to clarify our understanding of the many whys and hows of history, about the continuities and discontinuities that are at the very heart of the work of any professional historian. Any work that helps with this task is a contribution. Any work that persuasively calls to challenge existing conventional wisdom merits respect. And this, it seems to me, is very clearly the case here. And with that, I congratulate the author for this work, and I recommend to the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Helsinki to accept Brandon Reynolds' doctoral dissertation, Alternating Visions of Europe's Post-Cold War Security Architecture, Finnish, American, and Russian Peace Mediation in Nagorno-Karabakh, 1995-1997. End of story. Thank you.
If there are any questions from the audience, we will now take them.
I can see no questions coming from the floor, so I declare this examination closed.